What happened to us has a name:
Can someone please remind us what ethnogenesis is?
ethnogenesis, the birth of a new ethnic group.
African captives brought to the Americas were themselves vehicles of ethnogenesis. And ethnogenesis, like I said, encompasses both cultural change, identity formation, and community formation.
Cut off from tribal names, languages, faiths, and memory, our ancestors became a people not through inheritance, but through invention.
Some of these vehicles of ethnogenesis or sites where we started. I've talked about the example of the transplantation of African crops and mixed farming techniques, the culture example in the Low Country, transformation of tobacco and cotton plantation, and rebellious ethnogenesis through non-agricultural labor. Religion was also a major basis of Afro-ethnogenesis. African captives from the Congo region of Central Africa were transplanted to the low country regions of Georgia and South Carolina through the ports of Savannah and Charleston. These captives carried with them sacred conceptions of woods, trees, waters, and burial grounds to the Americas. And they used these conceptions as resources of refuge within bondage. The sun, something as natural as the sunlight, which marked the waking hours of labor for enslaved people from Central Africa regions, also represented Central African cycles of birth, maturity, death, and ancestry, inspiring slaves to undertake fatal acts of resistance in the hope of reincarnation in their own homelands. African beliefs were not just retained within the Americas, but they were memorialized, embodied, and recreated.
From that rupture, we formed a new cultural identity, forged in the fields, the pews, the back roads, the prisons, the movements. And the world has never seen anything like it.
Slaves used ritual objects and medicines. They enacted funerary rituals in the Low Country just as they had in the Congo. For example, ritual objects known as minkisi, which are variously described as conjure bags, conjure bottles, wax and mud, figurines, spears with pins and thorns, were used by root doctors, as they were called, both in Congo and contemporaneously in the Low Country. And these minkisi were used by root doctors who were African captives to heal the sick, reveal the unknown, protect one's body, trap evil spirits, and harm others.
From 1619 to now, we evolved into something distinct: African blood, Christian theology, native resistance, and American trauma.
And planters feared that slaves could poison them using minkisi. So there's documented evidence of planters believing in minkisi. There's also documented evidence that some Low Country whites became conjurers. They learned this knowledge from enslaved people and they themselves practiced conjuring. In Tennessee, Macon, a slaveholder permitted his slave, Jack, to go about the country practicing medicine. Macon, this slaveholder in Tennessee, later reported that Jack, quote, performed many cures of a most extraordinary character. Root doctors' reputation for harm and healing within slave communities enabled them to serve as mediators of grievances, enactors of social and community justice, and instigators of popular rebellion. So, how many of you has anybody here heard of a slave named the McVersey? Anybody? Okay. So the McVersey planned a rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. He carefully plotted this slave rebellion. And in so doing, he employed a slave conjurer named Gula Jack. He employed Gula Jack because he wanted to make sure that other slaves were encouraged to join the rebellion. Root doctors like Bulajak provided Minkisi to slaves like Frederick Douglass. Has anybody here heard of Frederick Douglass? Okay. So Frederick Douglass writes about carrying a form of Minkisi on the right side of his body, and that whenever he had it on his body, he was assured by the root doctor that he would not experience bodily violence from the overseers. These Minkisi, these forms of conjuring, shaped enslaved people's understandings of health and healing and sense of community. Although root doctors enjoyed more importance and community respect than preachers within slave communities in the low country regions, slaves also used their acquired knowledge of Christianity, which had reached Congo. If you recall, when I was talking about the Congo Kingdom and the Angola region, Christianity reached Congo as early as the 15th century. So enslaved people from that region who ended up in the low country regions of Georgia and South Carolina, some of them had converted to Catholicism. And in their New World environment, they used a combination of Christian and indigenous African religious belief systems to develop a moral ethic that was contrary to those of the master class. Whether we're talking about Christianity or indigenous African religious practices that slaves recreated in the New World, these rituals and these beliefs enabled enslaved peoples to create viable communities, to resist master class narratives that suggested that slaves were people who lacked spirit. They were people who lacked civilization and people who lacked humanity. So by recreating in very innovative and dynamic ways religious traditions, slaves were reinscribing their humanity and recreating communities. Military knowledge, besides religious knowledge systems, were also vehicles of Afro-Atlantic ethnogenesis. Has anyone here heard about the Stono Rebellion before? Okay, okay. So historians look at events like the Stono Rebellion as an example of a historical process or an event through which we begin to see how the actions of enslaved people show that they were people who embodied, herited, or learned knowledge systems like military service. On September 9, 1739, an African slave named Jemmy and a group of 20 Angolan slaves led the largest and costliest slave rebellion in the history of the United States against their white slave owners in Stono, South Carolina. The group of slaves that led the rebellion came from the Congo Kingdom. They spoke Portuguese and they practiced Catholic religion. These slaves seized a store of firearms and marched off on a trail of destruction and killing, with drums and banners flying, which attracted a crowd of African and American-born slaves to join them. Now numbering over 60 slaves, they organized a military drill. They stopped, took their time, and danced in an open field. As they beat their drums and sang and danced, more slaves joined them. Now, numbering 90 to 100 slaves, they continued marching, attacking property, and destroying them. In this way, they had a face-off with a white militia, and were eventually dispersed. But for the next 10 days, the slaves used guerrilla tactics against mounted troops. The slaves who led this rebellion were captives from the Congo civil wars of the 1730s. Their military knowledge in modern weapons, dancing drills, and skirmishing tactics shaped their adaptation to South Carolina plantation slavery. It shaped their identities and their cultural ethnogenesis. African captives with military knowledge beyond British colonial North America were also armed by European colonial armies in Spanish America, in the American Revolution, in the Haitian Revolution, in the French Caribbean, and even as late as the US Civil War and anti-colonial insurgency in Cuba. Both in the cases of slaves arming themselves to rebel, and in cases where masters armed their slaves for political purposes. Military knowledge enabled those Africans who were enslaved to seek freedom in revolutionary ways. So by looking at the revolutionary ways that slaves negotiated freedom, historians also try to re-excavate their ethnogenesis. The last example of knowledge system and praxis within which we can talk about Afro-Atlantic ethnogenesis is motherhood and rebellious pharmacological and medical knowledge. And for this, you're going to look at the British Caribbean island colony of Jamaica, where captives from the Bight of Biafra region of West Africa comprised a significant majority between 1750 and 1807. During this period, which was where we're nearing abolition, so from the second half of the 18th century, British planters were worrying about abolitionism because these were being debated in the British Parliament in London. And so planters worried about impending or looming abolition sought to use enslaved women's wombs to reproduce more slaves, because abolition meant that the Atlantic slave trade would end, but planters still needed slaves. So fearing abolition, they started encouraging natural reproduction. The relative degree of masters' control over enslaved women's wombs increasingly came to define the system of racialized slavery practiced in Jamaica in the second half of the 18th century. Jamaican planters encouraged sexual cohabitation among slaves. They provided lying-in houses and other facilities, as well as midwives for pregnant slaves. They even paid overseers a bounty for each slave child born under their watch. And they exempted enslaved women who had 6 children alive from working in the sugarcane fields. During this period, Jamaican planters singled out women of Igbo ethnicity as the most, quote, fertile of all African captives. And they tasked slave traders to supply them with, quote, Igbo women breeders. Planters' breeding policy resulted in the words of the historian Sasha Turner from their years observing enslaved Igbo women who, quote, had larger, more stable families and communities because they were generally more attached to the land, their children, and their spouses. I'm going to pause here and explain something. So, planters had been observing the kinship ethnogenesis practices of women from a particular ethnic group in the Bight of Biafra. And during the period of abolitionism, they wanted to exploit these kinship forms of ethnogenesis in order to reproduce slave populations. A few enslaved women, within these circumstances, began to use motherhood as a political strategy to gain additional provision grounds and housing spots, and through family formation and the perpetuation of language and culture, such enslaved women achieved ethnogenesis. So there were some enslaved women who capitalized on planters' needs to enhance their ethnogenesis, their community formation, their identity formation, and to improve the conditions of their enslavement. However, motherhood also hindered enslaved women's flight from slavery. And secondly, given that women in their childbearing years spend 88% of their working time in the great gangs, because we're talking about a gang labor system, they spend 88% of their working time in the great gangs. The great gangs were tasked with strenuous cane holding, so digging up the ground to plant the cane, planting and harvesting sugar canes, which, as I've mentioned, was a very dangerous task because the cane, the bark of the sugar canes were razor sharp, and you can get your hands sliced up. So these men spent 88% of the time doing the most strenuous forms of labor on sugar plantations. And additionally, given the type of labor they performed, they still faced inadequate nutrition, the tropical heat environment, tropical diseases. And therefore, in these circumstances, pregnancy was a very life-threatening experience. So not many enslaved women had the desire to bring children or to get pregnant within such an environment. 3, children presented planters the means to elicit compliance from slave mothers by threatening to separate them from their children. So, under slavery in Jamaica, motherhood was a disability from the experience of certain slaves. 4, pregnant slaves were subjected to excessive stooping, carrying heavy weights. They toiled under unceasing compulsion until 6 weeks before birth. And 4 weeks after delivery, they were returned to the second gang. 5, it was customary for overseers to lay pregnant women face down over a hole dug in the ground and then flog them on the back. One historian writes that white overseers, quote, kicked black women in the belly from one end of Jamaica to the other, resulting in complications in pregnancy, prolapsed uterus, and miscarriages. These dangers led some enslaved women to resist with abortions, with infanticide, with rebellious forms of motherhood. In order to do this, such women from the regions of the Bight of Biafra and the Gold Coast especially, went to a group of root doctors or medical practitioners known as the Obia. And the Obia provided them with abortifacients. These abortifacients were prepared with plants that enslaved people had brought with them from West and Central Africa. Plants such as okra and aloe. And in so doing, these women who were performing rebellious motherhood achieved what historian Orlando Patterson has called a gynecological revolt. So they were revolting with their wombs. They were resisting slavery with their wombs.
We're not all the same. The ethnogenesis of Black Americans. We are not just Black. We are Black Americans, a people born of captivity, raised through resistance, and forged into a lineage. We are not African, not Caribbean, not immigrants. We are something new, an identity born from erasure and built through fire. Our origin story is not one of migration, but of commodification. We are the sons and daughters of American chattel slavery. And that is not a claim, it is a fact. Synthesized into a cultural genome, we became a new nation within a nation. Listen to the blues. Watch the birth of hip-hop. Feel the rhythm of our walk, our talk, our protest, our joy. This is more than influence, this is identity. Our food, our language, our style of mourning, even our joy, is a product of our specific lineage. Soul food is not jollof rice. Our English is not patois. Our story did not begin in immigration lines. It began in ship holds. We are not just another Black people. We are the foundational Black Americans. This is a distinction, not a dismissal. The wealth of this nation sits atop our ancestors' graves. Dr. Claude Anderson calls us the economic base of America. We built the Southern economy. We helped finance the industrial North. We fought in every war. We were excluded from every wave of wealth. From the plantation to the projects, we paid America's bill and were handed poverty in return. What we built was not given to us, it was taken from us. We need to say this plainly. This is not about superiority, it's about specificity. Black immigrants come by choice. We were brought by force. They come under flags. We came in chains. Their stories matter, but they are not ours. Dr. Sandy Darity reminds us, reparations cannot be universal. It must be lineage-based. Otherwise, injustice is disguised as diversity. And when you erase our lineage, you erase our claim to justice, to reparations, to a name. The Freedmen's Bureau was for us. The GI Bill was denied to us. The Homestead Act was withheld from us. The Tulsa Massacre happened to us. Don't bury that under the blanket of blackness. We are not just black. We are Black American descendants of slavery. We are not asking for inclusion. We are demanding recognition. We want our name in the census, in the legislation, in the classroom. We are not here for symbolic gestures. We are the unpaid labor force that became the cultural architects of a nation. Our ancestors built the country, and we still carry the debt. The cotton didn't just grow, it bled. And it's still bleeding. Our pain birthed poetry. Our trauma produced culture. From spirituals to rap, from protest marches to community cookouts, we turned survival into style. But we are more than creators. We are inheritors of unfinished business. TikTok can remix our dances. Brands can sample our slang, but they can't duplicate our origin. We are not a monolith, but we are a lineage. This is the foundation of identity. Dr. Anderson warned, a group that doesn't name itself cannot protect itself. So we say it clearly. We are Black Americans. Not generic, not global, not interchangeable. We are specific, lineage-based, born from American soil and American suffering. This is not a war against the diaspora. This is a declaration of cultural sovereignty. If we don't define ourselves, we will be defined by those who benefit from our invisibility. We've been branded, boxed, erased, renamed, but we are still here. Our specificity is our shield, and our lineage is our law. We are not the leftovers of the Black world. We are the test case for human endurance. We are the blueprint for what happens when a people are broken and build themselves anyway. We are not all the same, and that difference is our power. We are Black Americans, a nation within a nation, and our story is still being written.
Ethnogenesis, origin of an ethnic group. Say it with me now, ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis. The emergence of a distinct, recognizable, ethnic identity. E. T. H. N.